Okay, we're in the section of Acts where we're looking at this missionary journey by Paul and Barnabas. And Paul, if you remember, he actually started off in Tarsus, then he ended up in Antioch, then he ended up in Seleucia, then he sailed across Cyprus and went across the entire island of Cyprus. Then he sailed up to Perga and Pamphylia, then went on up to Pisidian Antioch, then over to Iconium, and that's where we're picking up now. So he and Barnabas are in Iconium. And Acts 14:1 says, at Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. We talked about that earlier, how that was Paul's, the way he operated. When he could go to a town, if it was large enough to have a synagogue, he would go there first and speak to the Jews in the synagogue as well as the Gentiles that were there. And so, as it says, as he was there, they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Greeks believed. So you see the word, the church is growing, and he's even winning Christians out of the Jewish synagogue. And that obviously upset the Jews because they refused to believe, and that's what, as we're reading through Acts, that's what exactly happened. It says, but the Jews who refused to believe stirred up the other Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. And again, we talked earlier about Satan. That's one of his main ways of operating, is stirring up basically anything to poison someone's mind. And we see that all over the place in our country, even where if someone disagrees with someone, rather than stand on truth, they stir up these lies and things, and they poison people's minds against others. And that's exactly what happened. So Paul and Barnabas recognized this, and therefore they spent considerable time there. And again, I think it says, the reason it tells us they spent considerable time there is because they were trying to straighten out the poisoned minds. They were trying to get them to understand the truth so that their mind would no longer be poisoned. And they spoke boldly for the Lord, who confirmed the message of his grace by enabling them to perform signs and wonders. So we see them performing signs and wonders, showing that God is with them and helping those people who had their minds poisoned to find the truth. But again, the city was divided. And that's what it says. The people of the city were divided. Some sided with the Jews and the others with the apostles. What can create division in the world? Satan is the culprit behind all of it. But typically division occurs when you have two very people that are stuck in their ways and they refuse to listen to anyone, and you create division. Another way division occurs is just like we saw. You poison people's minds against someone and you create division. Well, that's what happened here. The other thing about division, if you turn to Matthew 10:34, we see Christ talking about how the church itself is going to create division. Because he says, don't suppose that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. He says, for I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. A man's enemies will be the members of his own household. So we're warned here that just speaking the truth is going to create division in the world. Because when you have Satan in the world, he doesn't want the truth to be there. So that automatically creates division. And that is between the world and the church. You can also have division inside the church, which is very bad because that really hurts the reputation of the church. It prevents God from moving in that church. And James talks about this in chapter 4, verses 1 through 2. He point blank asks the question, what causes fights and quarrels among you? In other words, what's causing the division? What causes people to be divided and to fight and quarrel inside the church? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? So he's saying there, division comes from sinful desires that are in each of us. He says, you desire, but you do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. So again, James is talking about inside the church, divisions and quarreling and fighting happen, but ultimately it's about sin. Somebody's got something you want that you don't have. You covet something someone else has and you don't have it. You covet your way, you want it to be all your way, and it's not. So you have quarrels and fights. We also see the scene kind of the same reference to this sinful nature in us creating division inside the church in Galatians 5, verses 19 through 21, where it says, when you follow the desires of your sinful nature, so there you go, sin, the sinful nature within us, the results are very clear. Here's a whole list of things: sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility. Notice what else is listed here: quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, decisions, divisions. It continues: drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Let me tell you again, as I've said before, that anyone living that sort of life will not inherit the kingdom of God. So what we have to be aware of is those are sins. Quarreling, outbursts of anger, dissensions, divisions, all of those are sins when they're done because you're wanting your way or it's because of your fleshly desires. And he gives us that warning there at the end. You cannot live like that and expect to be a Christian. That's what he's saying. Sin is what creates division in the church. Outside the church, it's Satan using people, stirring up lies against the church. When you have division within the church, it's sin that causes that division. It says there was a plot among both Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, to mistreat them and stone them. So this is Paul and Barnabas. So here they are in this town. There's this big division breaking out. You've got the Jews and against them, and then the Christian church there for them. So you've got this big division. And the Gentiles and Jews, these are the non-Christian Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, they are plotting. And what they're plotting to do is to mistreat Paul and Barnabas and stone them. That typically means to have them flogged or beaten and then stoned. And again, what does division typically lead to? Well, let's go back to what we just read in Galatians 5:19. You've got quarreling and fighting, outburst of anger. So all of these are, again, shows you what is happening whenever Satan gets involved in creating these divisions. But they, Paul and Barnabas and his group, found out about them teaming up against them, and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the gospel. So persecution hit. There was great division against them. They basically knew their lives were in jeopardy. God basically said, well, my work for you is done now in this town. I'm going to move you on. And what happens when the gospel when persecution hits? It spreads, and you see exactly happening here. They're going now to other cities and exclaiming, and there's still Christians in the city that they're leaving, and they're going to other cities now and creating Christians. So they were at Iconium, and now they're going back down to Lystra, and then over to Derbe. That's kind of their next destination of these towns after they were ran out of Iconium. So in Lystra, there sat a man who was lame. He had been that way from birth and had never walked. What is the significance of the fact that this man was born that way and had never walked? Tell us. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And I'm sure his legs are all shriveled up. He has no muscle tone in his legs, and you can clearly tell this man's been paralyzed since birth. So this man is listening. It says he listened to Paul as he was speaking. Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed. First of all, what do you think Paul was speaking about? What was Paul always speaking about? The good news, Jesus. He's preaching Jesus. So Paul is preaching Jesus, and this man's listening to him. And again, we see this back in 6 through 7. They were continuing to preach the gospel. That's what Paul's doing. He's preaching the good news of Jesus. He's preaching the gospel of Christ. So as Paul was speaking, he notices this man, because it says Paul looked directly at him, saw that he had faith to be healed. What do you think? That's interesting that's put in that the way this is written. It says Paul is speaking to this large crowd. All of a sudden he makes eye contact with this man who's paralyzed, so he's likely sitting on a mat with very weak legs or malformed legs or whatever it may be. But Paul looked at him and saw he had faith to be healed. What do you think Paul saw?
Happy and excited about what he was telling him.
Yep. Any other thoughts?
I think the spoke to
Yeah.
Paul.
Yeah.
Lit up.
He realized this man was taking him everywhere.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think Paul, and you can tell that if you're ever speaking to a crowd, whether you're teaching or talking, you can always tell the one that's engaged. It's just sitting there, and you can tell the ones that's on their phone or, just kind of looking around. Of course, they didn't have phones back then, but you can tell the ones that are engaged and are listening.
Right in the dirt.
Right, yeah. So I think Paul saw him. He's telling the gospel. He could very well had some tears coming down his. I mean, he's talking about Christ. Paul saw him, and what it means by him, I believe, he saw his heart. He saw this man's heart is right. Right. I would say he was emotional. I'd say he was paying attention. He's probably, like I said, tears flowing, and Paul noticed that, and he said he saw that he had faith to be healed. I want to point out, when you think of this, you often are thinking about his legs, which we do see that he does heal. But this word heal is very interesting. It's translated from a Greek word, sozo, and it means to save, to heal, to preserve, or to rescue. What's interesting, that word is the root word of soter, which is savior. It's the root word of soteria, which is salvation. And it's the root word of soterion, which means rescued from destruction and brought into divine safety. So I think you can see there was more to him being healed than just his legs. And again, that's why I think you saw him, tears in his eyes. He recognized who he was. He recognized he was a lost. He needed Christ. And it was Paul speaking here. Paul saw that. So, and he called out, "Stand up on your feet." At that, the man jumped up and began to walk. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, just someone has, let's say they've had a stroke or something, and they've lost the use of their legs, and that suddenly they start getting that usage back. Even after a short period of time, you go through months of physical therapy to be able to even walk again. Here, this man has never stood his entire life. And he actually jumps up, is the way it's put. So he literally he jumps up and starts walking. I mean, there's so many miracles in that alone. It's physically and from a medical standpoint, it's just amazing. It's a miracle.
Cerebral palsy.
Yeah, that's another good example. Yeah.
Never walked.
Yeah. And suddenly just able to get up and walk. He jumps up. And then when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they shouted in the Lycaonian language, "The gods have come down to us in human form." Why do you think they think that they're gods? Yeah, part of it is true. It's not their gods. The God has come down to them through Paul, but they still haven't got the point yet. They still haven't figured out what Paul and Barnabas are preaching about. This kind of gives you an insight, I think, into the build or the way Paul and Barnabas could have looked, because Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes because he was the chief speaker. Here are these two gods. Zeus is on the left and Hermes is on the right, so it kind of gives you an image of what probably Paul and Barnabas looked like too. Paul was probably more of a stockier guy, and Barnabas is probably more of a thin-built person. Yeah, and an age difference. That we do have a description of Paul, though, which is kind of interesting. This was written by a historian, and he wrote this book, The Acts of Paul, and Thecla. He says, Paul was a man small in size, bald-headed, bandy-legged, well-built, with eyebrows meeting, rather long nose, full of grace. So anyway, that's kind of a description of Paul. So you don't really know. He was short but well-built, is what it says. So he was a short, stocky guy, who Paul was. So the priest of Zeus, whose temple was just outside the city, brought bulls and wreaths to the city gates because he and the crowds wanted to offer sacrifices to them. What would most people do when people wanted to treat them like gods? Let's say a professional athlete, let's say movie stars, they would eat it up. Normal person, just our flesh is very prideful. And if someone comes to you and treats you like a god, most people would eat that up. No, I love what Paul and Barnabas says. It says, but when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of this, they tore their clothes and rushed out into the crowd shouting, "Friends, why are you doing this? We too are only human like you. We are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them." And he continues, "In the past he let all nations go their own way, yet he has not left himself without testimony. He has shown kindness by giving you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of foods and fills your heart with joy." Paul is speaking here, presenting the gospel to Gentiles, not to the Jewish nation. And notice the difference here, it's what I want you to note. Paul, when he would preach to the Jews, he would preach from the Old Testament and show from the Old Testament that Christ is Lord. What is Paul using here to show that God?
The New Testament that hadn't been written yet.
Right, the New Testament hadn't, and he's using
The story.
the world around him. He's saying, look, the real God made the heavens and the earth and the seas and everything in them. He's given you rain from heaven and crops in their season. He provides you with plenty of food. So he is actually preaching the gospel from God's creation instead of pulling out the Old Testament. Because where he's at now, he could have pulled out the Old Testament and been reading from it. They wouldn't even know what the Old Testament was. But they knew what's around them. He's using God's creation to show God, to preach God. So that's the big difference. I find that interesting, that he is presenting this gospel much different in Lystra than he did to the Jews. And I can't help but think of Romans 1:19 through 20. I know we've all heard this, but this is what Paul was using to preach the gospel. He says, "Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So we see Paul here really reaching out to those who are unchurched. They've not been to the synagogues. They don't know about the Old Testament. But what they do know about is the world around them. They know about the skies and the mountains and the rain. And he's using that as he teaches Jesus. Even with these words, though, they had difficulty keeping the crowd from sacrificing to them. So he's making some progress, but still they're hung up on sacrificing to them. And again, this is another example to show you they're not in a Jewish area, because the Jews would never offer sacrifices to them. They're clearly in a pagan area who've really never heard much of any kind of gospel. And all they've seen is the miracle, so immediately they want to start worshiping them. And he's preaching the gospel of Jesus from nature, from God's creation that's around him. But then notice what happens. Some Jews came from Antioch and Iconium. So now look who's coming all suddenly. This town that had no, basically, teaching about God at all. Now you've got not only the Christian church there, but now the Jews are coming into town. And imagine what the Jews are going to do. What are they going to create? Problems and confusion. They're going to confuse the division. And Paul had this group listening. They were turning to Christ. And then the Jews show up from Antioch, both Antioch and Iconium. And it says, and then the Jews won the crowd over. How do you think the Jews won the crowd over?
They convinced them they were not telling them the truth.
Right. I imagine, and you could probably picture this, Jesus called the Jews whitewashed tombs. They looked very godly on the outside. They wore all the big fancy clothes and all the fancy hats and robes and phylacteries and things all over them. So they looked like that they were some god the way they would dress. So that was their whole point. So I would imagine Paul and Barnabas were just regular folk come in there. As a matter of fact, it shows that they ripped their clothes trying to show them that we're just normal people. And then in comes just the regalia of Jews, all dressed up, and the crowd's following them. and I would say that's what won them over. Is the Jews looked more like God than Paul and Barnabas did.
Their idea.
Or that's what I mean. Their idea of a God. They looked more they looked more like a God. Let me put it that way, than Paul and Barnabas.
Still see that in the pagan
Yep.
countries.
Yep. You
Even
still see.
now.
Yep. And that's in essence where they were at. It would be like going to some third world pagan country. That's where they were at. They had not heard the Jewish or the gospel. And now they've heard both, and now the Jews come in and really confuse things. So the Jews created division, as you said, because it says the Jews came, won the crown over, and then look what they did. They stoned Paul and dragged him outside the city, thinking he was dead. What does that tell you about how badly he was stoned?
They're unconscious.
Yeah, he was unconscious and dead. They appeared dead. So this is interesting. A little bit later, Paul's going to tell a story about a man who was caught up into heaven, and he's giving almost a near-death experience is what he's describing. Many think he's talking about himself from this point. They think Paul had a near-death experience. He was almost dead. He was, and God kept him alive. But the other thing is, what was the Jews teaching, do you think? If all the Jews came and was just trying to teach that the Jewish faith was the true faith and Jesus was false, why would they want to take Paul out and stone him to death? What else do you think they were teaching?
They were teaching him he was from Satan.
Yes, they were, just like they did before, stirring up, poisoning their minds. This is a perfect example of poisoning their minds. They poisoned this city's minds, this town's mind against Paul, to the point they were initially responding to him, listening to him. They saw him perform a miracle, and now they're killed. They killed him. They wanted to kill him. And this is what's interesting too. If you were, I just hate to guess what he would look like because you were just beat all over with stones. So he had to be bruised, bloodied, teeth knocked out. Hard telling what he looked like.
Have a brain bleed.
Yeah.
Hit him in the head with rocks.
Yeah, he probably did. So when he comes to, and he gains conscious again, what would you do if a city had just drug you out of town and basically tried to kill you? What would you do when you came to?
Leave.
I would leave. But look what Paul did. But after the disciples had gathered around him, look what he did. He got up and went back into the city. The next day, he and Barnabas left for Derbe. Why do you think he wanted to go back to the city?
So they could see he wasn't dead.
Yes, so he could see he wasn't dead.
And what he said was true.
And what he said was true. You're absolutely right. And again, he immediately after he got up, he went into the city too. He wanted them to see what condition he was in too. I imagine he came in looking pretty rough. He says, "You did this to me." I'm sure he preached the gospel, and I'm wondering if he didn't tie Christ. We don't know that, but it's just my guessing. I'm wondering if he didn't tie. You did the same thing to Jesus. You killed him on a cross, and if you don't listen to what I'm saying, you're going to die in your sins. So I imagine he gave a message before he left. And again, he went right back in. So he went from Lystra to Derbe, back to Lystra, and now he's going to Iconium and Antioch. So he's kind of backtracking from where he came. So they preached the gospel in the city and won a large number of people. Then they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. So here we go, Derbe, then back to Lystra, Iconium, and then back to the city in Antioch. And all the time they were strengthening the disciples and encouraging them to remain true to the faith. We must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God, they said. What does that statement say to you when it says we must go through many hardships to enter the kingdom of God?
It's not going to be easy.
It's not going to be easy. And I imagine Paul is saying this, and it would take quite a while to heal from all those being almost stoned to death. So I imagine Paul still looks pretty bad, all bruised up, beat up, and he is, as he's standing up, he's using himself an example. I can see him talking about himself. It's not going to be easy being a Christian, people. That's what he's saying. So then Paul and Barnabas appointed elders for them in each church, and with prayer and fasting committed them to the Lord in whom they had put their trust. So now we see these churches are forming in all these little towns. And what Paul and Barnabas are doing, they originally preached the word and planted the church. Now on the way back, they are setting up the leadership in the church. So they're appointing elders to lead those churches. And then they're setting them aside with prayer and fasting. Again, it shows you that Paul and Barnabas were praying for these churches. And it's part of, best way to put that, they ordained them. Ordained means you set them aside. So these are ordained elders. They prayed over, fasted with them, committed them to the Lord because they had put their trust in the Lord. So now that as they go back, they're establishing the elders and the leadership in these churches that they had just established. So after going through Syria, they came into Pamphylia, and when they reached the world, when they had preached the word in Perga, they went down to Attalia. So again, if you look at this map, they were sitting in Antioch. Now they're going back down to Perga, and then they're going to go over to Attalia. Well, from Attalia, they're right there on the coast. So guess what they did? From Attalia, they sailed back to Antioch, where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work they had now completed. So they're returning back home. So this is the end of this first missionary journey. So he's sailing now from Attalia all the way back to Antioch, kind of where they first started at. And what's interesting here, you see they're coming back and they're giving a missionary report to the church. It says, on arrival, they gathered the church together and reported all that God had done through them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. Why is it important that we share our Christian experiences with others in the church? Many times you hear about sharing your faith outside the church, sharing for what God has done for you outside the church. But here they're sharing inside the church all that God had done for them while they were on their missionary trip, missionary journey. Why is it important that people give testimonies in churches?
To encourage each other.
Right, to encourage and see and hear what God's doing. We can read all about in the Bible as far as their experiences, but there's something special when someone stands up in church and says, I'm going to give a testimony. You know, this is happening, this is now happening, God's done this. It's really encouraging the church to see God moving in the church. So it says, and they stayed there a long time with the disciples. So they're back in Antioch now in the church. They're giving their missionary journey, talking to them about all that had happened. And as you can imagine, what's going to happen, do you think, now that they're here back in Antioch and things are really taking off again? They're sharing about all that's happened. The church is growing. Who do you think is going to step in? Satan. And we'll stop here. I'm going to pick up in 51 next week, but this just tells you certain people came down from Judea to Antioch.
We know who they are.
And we're teaching the believers, and you can know who they are just to listen to what they're teaching. Unless you are circumcised, according to customs taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. And we're going to pick up there next week. So they're back in Antioch, and again, here comes the Jewish, back again, this Jewish teaching. There's certain people, we'll get more into detail about it, but these may very well have been Jews that had converted to Christ, but they didn't understand it all yet. But regardless, it was either Jews or misinformed Christians have come down and are basically trying to put back on them again the laws of Moses of being circumcised and all the stuff that applied to the Jews. They're adding to it. And we still see that today. We see churches wanting to bring back Jewish customs. And a lot of times a church gets consumed with Jews and with the Hebrew and with all this other stuff, and they get misled. They start going backwards instead of forwards. So anyway, yep. So we'll stop there, and again, appreciate your attention, and hope you all learned something from that, and we'll pick up in Acts 15:1 next week. Joe, do you want to close in prayer?